In the meantime, I'm very happy to be joined by Rand Paul and Kelly Paul. They know a thing or two about some of the violence that we have seen at some rallies, particularly this latest rally on behalf of the president, and let the count go on in Washington, that by nighttime it turned into something that probably looked eerily familiar to them. Senator and Mrs. Paul, thank you for joining us. I hope you're doing okay.
Thanks.
You know, when you saw what was going on in Washington over the weekend, it did look eerily familiar what you encountered leaving the White House after the big event and the president's speech there, where you just were knee-deep in protesters. It got pretty scary. Did this seem similar to that, Senator?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think it seems very similar. But I guess what's even more disturbing is that you have both right and left calling the other side fake news. Many of us say, well, you know, Associated Press, certainly that's objective news. But the AP reported this story yesterday, and I read the Associated Press story. I had no idea who was attacking who and for what reason. They wouldn't describe that these were people attacking Trump, people there supporting the president. They just made it sound like, oh, it was just random violence caused by the Trump rally. This is the same thing that happened to us when we were there. And Kelly can recount it well. The way the AP reported our story was abominable and just completely biased.
What I noticed, Mrs. Paul, on that, to your husband's point, was how protesters with divergent views, those pro-Trump, let the count go on, those protesting what they were talking about, were actually mingling with one another. They were in the same space. That was exactly what you had encountered, with a lot more of the protesters, you know, opposed to Donald Trump, opposed to Republicans and conservatives. So it's happened again.
Yes, I think what's important to realize, and there are a multitude of videos on the internet of this happening, just to innocent, ordinary people. These folks are not agitating. After the rally, they were in restaurants, they were walking back to their hotels, and they were being mobbed and assaulted by crowds of Antifa and Black Lives Matter, shouting horrible things at them, the same thing that they were doing to us. And again, these aren't folks that were trying to agitate or do anything. They were trying to get back to their hotels. What caused me to tweet out at the AP was the scene of that young girl and her parents. Her big brother had his arm around her. She's like 10 or 11 years old. She's in tears, and she's being screamed at horrible stuff by grown men with megaphones. And the whole family looked absolutely terrorized. And I know exactly what that felt like. And it broke my heart looking at that. And then I saw people sitting in restaurants, and a Black Lives Matter supporter threw a commercial-grade firecracker at them. I mean, what's it going to take for the mainstream media to really report on this? Is somebody going to have to get horribly burned or assaulted? It's just outrageous. These thugs are just roaming the streets and just accosting people who are doing nothing more than trying to get back to their hotels.
This seemed to accelerate as soon as it turned to night, I guess. And Senator, one of the things we learned, the Department of Homeland Security had warned of violence on both sides and concerns that earlier on, this is before this latest dust-up this past weekend, that white supremacists were the most persistent threat to our homeland. But that's not so. It's not just white supremacists. I mean, there are these Antifa and other groups that, have anarchy in mind. So if there's such a thing as spreading the blame here, there's enough to spread around.
Well, here's the thing. If you read the Associated Press story from last night, you can't tell who the people are that are arrested. Everybody arrested were the people attacking the Trump supporters. There was a mother with her child in a stroller being attacked. These were the anti-Trump people creating the violence entirely. And yet you read AP and it doesn't even describe who these people are. They say the Trump demonstrations led to violence. Do you know when the mob attacked us and they nearly toppled a policeman and I helped to stabilize him? The AP reported that, oh, the policeman was jostled. That's not the truth. Whatever happened to the Associated Press, which was supposed to be an objective beacon of truth? So we complain that there's right and left in our country, but what if the center, what if those who say they are objective are no longer objective? Where will people find their news?
You know, Mrs. Paul, one of the things I did notice, and we touched on in the beginning with your husband as well, this notion that the protesters of extreme views can be in the same place at the same time. There's got to be a way to avoid that. Passions run deep. They turn violent. There's got to be a way of separating crowds when this sort of happens, because it's happened enough here. And I think it's fair to say, in looking at this, that those who were marching on behalf of Donald Trump and letting the count go on were being very, very well behaved. And then those, of course, when it turned nightfall, much as we've seen in other incidents, erupted into violence, but that they were seen together, much as when you guys came out of the White House at the time of the RNC convention, when the president wrapped up his remarks, they had sort of intermingled and were on top of each other. Unfortunately for you, the guys who didn't share your views were in the overwhelming majority. There's got to be a better way to handle this. What do you think?
Well, I think one of the things when you look at it, go ahead, Kelly.
Well, I think that one of the big problems, and I put this on, Mayor Bowser in D.C. I love D.C., and what happened to us and what is happening to that city is that they are actually blocking off streets. And these folks that were attacked, Neil, going to their hotels were just like us. They weren't actively demonstrating or doing anything. They were just trying to get home, to get to their cars, to sit in restaurants. And these groups are now coming after anybody that they perceive is a Trump supporter. And it bothers me so much that Antifa, which is a group that professes to be anti-fascism, but basically they want to terrorize, bully, intimidate, and shout down anyone who disagrees with them. And that is the definition and the essence of fascism itself. And they don't care if, as I said, you're a young family with kids. I saw an elderly lady trying to get to her hotel, and she had an American flag, and they're ripping it out of her hands and getting up in her face and flipping her off. These people are thugs, and they need to be denounced, and there need to be more police out in D.C. protecting people who want to eat in restaurants and stay in hotels and come and enjoy D.C., whether they're for a protest or not. I have to say, the last time I was in D.C., I was getting ready to go for a run, and I was afraid. I grabbed a T-shirt out of my drawer, and I was afraid to put it on because it had an American flag on it. Just a simple American flag, but I was afraid to wear it in D.C. today.
Incredible. Senator, I do remember vividly watching the video of you and your wife leaving at the time. There were no police around. I mean, a couple of guys who was trying to help you out, but they were overwhelmed. Here, there were plenty of police around, but it seemed like they were caught off guard by this and overwhelmed by this. What do you do?
Well, you said, how do we separate the peaceful from the non-peaceful? I think that's actually pretty easy. There have been many peaceful Trump demonstrations, and there have been some peaceful demonstrations for racial justice. There have been. I won't say there haven't been. But as soon as they become not peaceful, arrest the people and put them in jail. One of the people that assaulted my wife and I bloodied a police officer. He required stitches, but you know what the D.C. judicial system did? They released him on his own recognizance. The thing is, there are violent people in these mobs, and they have to be arrested every time, and they have to be punished. And it's not very hard to separate out violent from non-violent, and peaceful protests can go on, but when they're not peaceful, you got to arrest people. But like in Portland, they just weren't arresting anybody, so it gets worse. Arrest them and put them in jail if they're committing a crime.
We still have this unresolved election, Senator and Mrs. Paul, and I'm wondering, Senator, your point, there is this recount going on in Georgia that should be resolved by tomorrow night. Do you think that should that vote come in as it has, and that there's still a difference of 12,000 or more votes, that the president should give up the fight?
I think the recall itself is unlikely to change the vote. Recalls rarely change the vote. What I think we need to do is examine the validity of the votes. So, for example, usually less than 1% of people vote absentee, and so it's never been much to change anything except for a very close election. But now you have about a third of the vote in Georgia came in by mail, and we should verify it. So what I've advocated for is do a random sampling of about 2,000 people from Fulton County and actually ask them, did you vote? Check on the signature, check each ballot in a way in which you were contesting whether they're valid or not. And if out of 2,000 you get 2 or 3, that's not enough to overturn the election. But if you do a random sample of 2,000 and you find 100 bad ballots, You multiply that out, that is plenty to change the election. But I think the best way to figure this out and the best way to give Republicans assurance that it was legitimate is let's do some real random sampling, not just counting the votes, but actually seeing if these people actually voted and if it was them.
So, Senator, do you see Joe Biden as the next president of the United States?
I think that we need to explore all the legal avenues, come to a conclusion. Look, this isn't new in our country. In 1976, my dad lost by 200 votes out of 200,000. We found 13 people voting from the same household. We found people voting from vacant lots, post office boxes. We found one entire precinct of 2,000 people, all the same signature to be signing in, and every vote was for the Democrat. So this happens in our country, but what we have to do is you have to either prove it or not prove it, and it is difficult to overturn elections. That's why the best chance of stopping fraud is stopping it before it happens. And I don't know that it did or didn't happen, but I think the best way to know if it happened in Philadelphia and in Atlanta is to do a random sampling large enough that you could apply that conclusion to the whole to see if the election could have been changed.
Mrs. Paul, if I could end with you on this. Of course, you and your husband caught in that melee back in August. I think it obviously seared you, knowing how dangerous that was, but it's probably indicative of the times in which we live. Are you confident, should Joe Biden take office on January 20th, that he can calm things down, that he can kind of detach this polarization going on? Or is this just a sign of our times, and sadly, we're going to see more of it? Sadly, we're going to see opportunities where you want to go out in the streets of Washington and you're anxious to.
I am not confident at all, because I think that if he were really trying to call for unity, as he says that he is, he would have called out by name the groups that were responsible for the attacks on Trump supporters Saturday night, and he did not. He's continuing to kind of buy into this whole polarization thing. And I blame the media as well. As Rand said, after we were assaulted in the most horrific and terrifying night of my life, the AP claimed, again, that our claim was without evidence, and said that the police officer who was literally having to hold a bike out as a barricade was only jostled, as if he were inadvertently bumped on a subway car or something, instead of a violent mob that he was desperately trying to hold back and help us get into our hotel because we could not move at all as they were screaming things. Everyone needs to really report fairly on what is going on, and I think that Joe Biden needs to also call out these groups by name.
On that point, I'd said it, the last question would be to you, Ms. Paul. Actually, you mentioned something that I do want to raise with your husband. Senator, I believe Joe Biden's remarks after this is people got to cool it on both sides. I'm paraphrasing here. Everyone's got to come down on both sides. Now, no one second-guessed those remarks as they did the president when he said essentially the same thing. What did you make of it?
Well, that's been misreported since the very beginning, because Trump was never referring to the people that committed violence and killed someone in Charlottesville. He was referring to the people debating over whether statues should come down, that there was a reasonable argument on both sides, and that has been so misreported. And see, even AP and so-called objective sources of news misreported that. So yeah, we do need to be honest, and I don't know if things will calm down or not. I want them to. I think to my colleagues in the Senate, I say, yes, let's calm down and let's actually talk. When President Obama was president, I was civil. I went to the White House. When President Trump became president, most of the Democrats would not go to the White House. They hated him so much that I think many of them incited the violence. And if you look at the preponderance of violence, it's been anti-Trump. It hasn't been Trump protesters. You got grandma out there waving a flag, and you've got thugs hitting grandma in the face with a 2x4. This is not the right committing violence. This is the left committing violence to peaceful people in the streets, and they need to be arrested. If there's anybody on the right that's doing it, arrest them too. Arrest anybody committing violence.
All right. Final word, Senator Paul. Mrs. Paul, thank you both very much. Be safe, be well. I think you reminded us all that everyone's got to dial it back a lot and fast. A little more to this.